One of the challenges of reading Moby-Dick, 1851, is that the novel asks us to think about ways of storytelling that do not fit within the frameworks of the traditional novel at all. Certainly, up until 1850 or so, most novels you would read in English, say aside from Tristram Shandy by Lawrence Sterne, most novels would proceed in a fairly linear fashion with a fairly consistent point of view. So, uh, one event would lead to another, would lead to another, would lead to another logically, and we might have, say, third person omniscient point of view rendering these events for us. We might have first person rendering these events for us. But Moby Dick formally is quite bold in that it breaks fairly early from any linear vision of storytelling. And also, it breaks pretty early from any consistent point of view. So, for the first, say, several chapters, we see Ishmael trying to find a whaling ship to sign on to, and he becomes friends with Queequeg, and they get on the ship, and we get to meet all the various crew members, not all of them, but most of them, and we get to meet Ahab, and things seem to be moving in a pretty linear fashion. But then all of a sudden we start getting chapters like the cetology chapter, which for several pages simply talks about various ways to classify different whales. At the end of this chapter, Ishmael, our narrator, basically says trying to classify whales is like trying to classify chaos. This classification is but a draft of a draft. Ultimately says that all great things in the world are incomplete, and this chapter on cetology, meant to provide a nice, neat classification of whales, ultimately points to the fact that there is no way of providing a complete classification of anything in this super abundantly disorderly world. There are many other such moments in the novel which totally forsake the idea of a forward moving story. You can think of the whiteness of the whale, for example. So part of the reason, the whiteness of the whale chapter, so part of the reason Melville is doing this is because he's not simply writing a novel, he is, but he's writing an anatomy, going all the way back to Robert Burton's Anatomy of Melancholy from the 17th century, based on the notion that one, if one wants to study a subject, say melancholy or say the whale, one should examine that subject from almost every angle possible. So Ishmael attempts to examine the whale from scientific point of view, from mythological point of view, religious point of view, artistic point of view. I could go on and on. So the anatomy aspect of the book is constantly pushing against the more linear push of the story. It's as if there's a spatial way of thinking about the world. That's the anatomy. The idea that I can kind of inhabit all these different perspectives and look at a subject from all these different perspectives. And then, of course, there's the temporal point of view, which would be the logical unfolding of the narration. Point of view. Clearly, we get Ishmael's point of view for the majority of the novel, but then there are scenes that Ishmael simply could not have witnessed. Many of them, for instance, when he's imagining what goes on in the captain's quarters during the hours of dining. There's no way Ishmael could see into the captain's quarters and describe what happens with such specificity. There are also moments when Ahab seems to be alone, entering into Shakespearean soliloquies. There's no way that Ishmael could hear these things. So our point of view is fragmented early and often as well. And interestingly, Ishmael never really calls attention to the fact that he's describing things that can't really be described, almost as if he's trying to dupe the reader into assuming that he's everywhere all the time. So these discontinuity in storytelling, discontinuity in point of view, invite us to think about structures in the novel that are not necessarily developmental. What do I mean? We can start looking at chapter relationships and how clusters of chapters suggest certain ideas, certain motifs, not because they are unfolding in a linear way, but because of how they are, say, juxtaposed to one another. So a classic example of this would be chapter 35, the Mast-head, followed by chapter 36, the quarterdeck. So at the end of the Mast-head, Ishmael imagines a young Platonist who has come to sea for romantic melancholy reasons, and he is ultimately absent-minded, disgusting with the carking cares of earth and seeking sentiment in tar and blubber. He is a bit like a Byronic hero. So this sounds like Ishmael. Even though Ishmael refers to this character in the third person, Ishmael has already thought about the world from a Platonic point of view. He's talked about how there's the distinction between body and soul, and that soul is eternal and body is not. Yes, he could have gotten this from, say, Paul, the letters of Paul, the Christian theologian, but there's a kind of Platonizing in Ishmael in that he's constantly turned the world into a kind of allegory, as if time is but a moving image of eternity. This is what Plato says in the Timaeus. And of course we know that Ishmael goes to sea to escape melancholy, as this character does. So he's imagining this Platonist, this melancholy Platonist, seemingly himself, up on the masthead and not really looking for whales at all because he's starting to daydream. And he suddenly has this pantheistic daydream where he feels his ego go away, his discrete self go away, and he feels as if he's distributed throughout the entire ocean. Here's the language. This young melancholy Platonist, while standing on the masthead, is lulled into such an opium-like listlessness, a vacant unconscious reverie, that this absent-minded youth, by the blending cadence of waves with thoughts, loses his identity. He takes the mystic ocean at his feet for the visible image of that deep blue bottomless soul pervading mankind and nature. And every strange, half-seen, gliding, beautiful thing that eludes him, every dimly discovered uprising fin of some undiscernible form, seems to him the embodiment of those elusive thoughts that only people the soul by continually flitting through it. In this enchanted mood, thy spirit ebbs away to whence it came. And this young Platonist feels no life within him now except that rocking life imparted by the gently rolling ship. He becomes a kind of Emersonian transparent eyeball where he becomes nothing and sees all and feels the currents of the universal being circulate through him and feels as if he is part and parcel of God. But then the chapter ends with a joke that if you become this way while on the masthead, if you take one tiny step to the left or the right, you could fall to your death because gravity will take over, and you are a body. Even if you think you can escape your body into the sea and expand throughout the entire watery cosmos, you still are a body and you can fall to your death. So there's this kind of Emersonian moment of becoming a transparent eyeball, but Ishmael is kind of also mocking the Emersonian for having his head in the clouds too much and putting his body into danger. So a self can become distributed. A self can become nothing and everything. But if you become nothing and everything, you better watch out because you might fall to your death if you take one false move. Now, right after this moment, describing this pantheistic bliss that could turn to pantheistic danger, is the quarterdeck chapter, which of course features Ahab's famous speech to the crew where he is trying to convince them to hunt the white whale. And he says things such as this: after Starbuck says, "Why would we hunt a dumb brute, Captain? You're attributing human agency to a dumb brute. You're making a category mistake. The whale did not take your leg off on purpose, by choice. It just did what an animal does." And here's what Ahab says: all visible objects, man, are but pasteboard masks. But in each event, in the living act, the undoubted deed, there, some unknown but still reasoning thing puts forth the moldings of its features from behind the unreasoning mask. If man will strike, strike through the mask. How can the prisoner reach outside except by thrusting through the wall? To me, the white whale is that wall shoved near me. He tasks me. He heaps me. Talk not to me of blasphemy, he says to Starbuck. I'd strike the sun if it had insulted me. So here's an opposing vision of ego, where basically Ahab is a self up against the objects of the world in a violent way. Everything is a pasteboard mask, kind of pressing against him. And behind the pasteboard mask, what is there? Is there something reasoning? Is there something unreasoning? He doesn't know. But the only way to find out is to strike through the mask. So there's no gentle transcendence of self into the ocean here. There's a violent opposition between self and world, subject and object. And Ahab basically says, my ego is so powerful that even if the sun itself were to strike me, I would strike it back. If it insulted me, I would insult it back. Of course, we know that this monomania, as Ishmael calls it, even though it shows a kind of Shakespearean grandeur to Ahab, also we know that it is dangerous, destructive, that it could easily lead to mutiny because the crew members ultimately want to make money and they can't do that by hunting one whale, but also hunting this vicious whale with this long history of violence could lead to tragedy for the ship. So in both instances, masthead, quarterdeck, we have a vision of self. Self as potentially able to distribute throughout the cosmos, self as a self-contained unit pressed against the universe. But also we have hints of criticism of both of these visions of self. The pantheist, one false step, he could fall to his death because he forgets he has a body. The egomaniacal captain, in asserting these divisions, could possibly cause great destruction. So we can see these two chapters juxtaposed as a kind of point and counterpoint, which invites us to see Ishmael and Ahab not simply as characters, but as kind of principles in the novel, where you have Ishmael, who's constantly trying to merge with others. He's constantly trying to befriend others. He wants to. He says, "Queequeg and I are like we're married." Even though he's different than I am, I want to be as he is. So there's a great empathy in Ishmael, and this is what makes him such a good narrator. Even if he can't see and hear everything he writes about, there's a sense that he's constantly trying to merge empathetically with others, even trying to think about where Ahab's pain comes from. Ahab, of course, is a principle of difference. He is Ahab. If Ishmael's identity becomes very wispy throughout the course of the novel, who is Ishmael really? And it's hard to get a sense of who he is. With Ahab, we have a very strong sense of who he is. And there's a power, there's a grandeur to Ahab as well. It's not as if Melville's saying Ishmael's better than Ahab or Ahab's better than Ishmael. He's holding up two different ways of thinking about not just these characters, but about how to inhabit the world in general. But to add a little lower layer to this ambiguity, we have to remember that Ishmael and Ahab are not diametrically opposed in all cases. Ishmael says he's an orphan. Ishmael says that Ahab is an orphan. Ishmael says he's melancholy. He has the hypos. Ishmael is very aware of Ahab's mighty woe. Ishmael is constantly looking at the things about him in the world and meditating on their ultimate meaning. Ahab is constantly doing the same thing. So, even though these characters do suggest opposing worldviews, there's a way in which these characters are also overlapping. So, which is it? Well, it's both. Ishmael says that one great thing about the sperm whale is that it has two horizons of vision. It can see from eyes on both sides of its head. It has a kind of double vision. Can't see straight ahead. But there's a sense that this novel, to read it in the spirit in which it was written, requires a kind of double vision, an ability to hold opposing views in your head at the same time.